Hello WCA, Mike Amori. How's everyone doing? This is our first update video. It's actually before class has started. You will be getting one of these lovely videos every Monday. And there'll be a combination of a review from what we've done the day before in class, and then also something or some things you can work on between the classes. Okay, most of the time when you're studying chess at home, you really should be working on tactics, solving puzzles, and then of course playing. If you get a chance to play online or play tournaments in between your classes, that's really the way to go. Okay, so let's take a look at this position, which is from a master game. One of the things we're going to be working on this year in all of the classes is the ability to talk to yourself when you play. Now, you got to be careful with that because you don't want to talk to yourself out loud. They'll throw you out of the tournament. But if you can create an inner dialogue, that means, you're keeping the conversation in your head, you can start to learn some of the things that masters think about during the games. And I borrowed some terms from a great chess author named Jeremy Silman, and he, among others, used words like material. So if I asked you to look at this position and say who has more material, you can easily count this up and see that it's equal. Each team has 3 minor pieces. You can count the pawns, the queens, the rooks, etc., right? Material is equal. Then we can start talking about superior minor pieces. And again, some of you are new to the WCA, so I think everybody knows that a minor piece is a knight or a bishop, but you may not really know that masters compare them so deeply, and they really do. So in a position like this, you might say that white minor pieces are a little bit better than black's because, or you think black's minor pieces are better, and you would have a reason. I'm going to start moving this mouse cursor around. We're going to be talking about pawn structure. This is not symmetrical, this pawn structure. You can see that black has 4 pawns. If I were to draw a line right down the middle here, black has 4 pawns on this side of the board and white has 4 on this side, so they're not symmetrical. We're going to be talking about space. Masters are always concerned with how much space they have, and your space is usually determined by your pawn that has advanced the most up the board. So that you see that white has a pawn on e4 and that pawn has advanced 2 boxes, and that black's further pawn or the pawn that's been pushed the most has only been pushed out 3 ranks. So all of this room underneath this pawn belongs to white. And you can see that black is a little cramped in this position. Okay, we're going to talk about key files and squares. So if I show you this position and then I jump to the position that's actually from the game, which is this position, and you'll notice that if I go back, white's pieces are not moving. So this is just a sample set position. This is the one from the game we're going to study today. But you see the pawn structure has changed. You see that these little guys are doubled here on the C file. So there's a little bit of a change, and also the location of this bishop. So I mentioned before, we're going to be studying things like key files and squares. Well, look at the B file. You see where my mouse is here? At some point, if this rook comes to B8, that's obviously going to be a road or a line that these players are going to be fighting for. And it looks like black is going to be the one to make use of that. How about on the white side? You see that there's no white D pawn on the D file. So this file is half open. So clearly, as you're talking to yourself, trying to find a move in a game, you're going to be paying very close attention to squares and files that can be used in your games. Okay, how about things like development? Clearly you want to ask who is better developed in a position. So let's go back to the original one that I showed you here. It's pretty equal. The only difference on the white side, you may notice that the white rooks are connected, which is a concept in chess. Connecting your rooks means that there are no lazy minor pieces in the back row. Black only needs to move the queen, but it's not clear that she has to move in this position. But the development is, maybe you can say white is slightly ahead in development. But let me show you a funny position just to talk about development for a second. Okay, take a look at this one. Pretty interesting, right? So who has a lead in development? Well, pretty clear it's white. Black doesn't have any pieces out. They just have a pawn. But, just because you have a lead in development doesn't mean, you're winning the game or that you're better. Because if it's black's move in this position, does anybody notice that, let me just move this queen out here. And I believe that is checkmate. So, just because you have a lead in development doesn't mean you're winning the game. Okay, back to our game here. So if I were to take you back to the beginning of the game, you would see that, well, basically I'm going to show you how we got to this position. And then I'm going to talk about one more factor that masters talk about, which is king safety. It's clearly something you should always be, concerned with in your games. But in the game that we're looking at, it begins with the move e4, e5. White attacks the pawn in the middle and black plays d6. And whenever black has this kind of pawn formation, when it's a double king pawn opening, you see I'll turn them on. This here is known as the Philidor pawn structure. And again, please, if you're new to the WCA, this video is something of, I don't want to call it a test, but it's really a good introduction to the rich language that chess has. So you're obviously going to be hearing a lot of words today that you may not understand. And of course, the kids and adults who have been with me for a long time will know a lot of this. I'm not really concerned with how much you know. I'm just concerned with you being able to pick up as you go along. So as you watch these videos, if there's a word or some concept you don't know, come into class and ask me a question. So from this Philidor pawn structure, one of white's most effective way to play against this is to break, to play a pawn break in the middle of the board. And a pawn break is simply when you see two pawns that are bumping heads in the middle, like these two, and then you attack them from the side. So after d4, black took. White has two ways to take back, and some of the students that have been around for a long time know that in this particular position, it's perfectly fine to take with the queen, because normally you don't want to bring her out early and have her kicked around the board. But here, as in the game, if black tries to attack your queen, you do not have to move her. If you don't know why you don't have to move the queen, pause the video. And that's advice I can give you for any WCA video or any chess video. Always know how to pause the video and be able to think for a while and answer a question. So here, why doesn't white have to move the queen? Because they can pin the knight with the bishop. So in the position, the bishop pins the knight to the king, and black immediately breaks the pin, giving white a problem. White either moves the queen or has to trade the bishop for the knight. So the way white is playing this opening, they want to keep the queen in the center, so they take the knight, giving black an interesting choice. If you take back here with the bishop and then continue to play very natural developing moves like knight c3, knight f6. Now, what are these players doing? They're just bringing their pieces out to very natural squares. Bishop to e7 breaks the pin so that the knight is no longer pinned to the queen. And let's say both kings castled on opposite sides of the board here. Well, this is the exact same position I started the video with. So if I went back to this position where white just traded their bishop for the knight, you'll see that black had the option and did take the option of taking with the pawn, which changes things a little bit because that little b pawn, when it turns into a c pawn, is controlling the d5 square. And that's something positive for black, because as the game continued, knight c3, you see that this knight can no longer get into the center because of this pawn over here. So that's kind of an upside for black. Also, you can see that black may use the open b file at some point. So you may ask, then why do most players actually take with the bishop in that position? And that's because these pawns tend to weaken a little bit when they get doubled like this. Okay, it can be played both ways. Black brings out a knight, and white just plays the same exact moves that I showed you. Bishop to g5, bishop to e7, breaking the pin, castle. And here, black is not interested in castling on this side of the board, not only because it's going to take a long time. I mean, how do you get your queen out? But also with these holes over here, it may be a bit difficult to play the middle game. So black just castles on the other side of the board. Okay, so from here, if we were to talk about what to do, like how do I continue these games if it were my own game? So white in this position, and I was fortunate enough to have some notes, which is nice because I get to get inside the heads of these masters when they play and kind of know in advance what they're thinking about. And then my job as an author of a video is, well, how do I get my students to understand what these players are talking about? You know, because sometimes I don't know what they're talking about. So you have to put some time into this and some thought. But the player with the white pieces said, when black plays with these doubled pawns and all of these, you know, this pawn formation looks pretty good right here. But one of the problems with this pawn structure is if it gets broken. Like if you could just imagine this pawn disappearing off the board. You know, I'll let it hang out with the king here. You see these two C pawns over here, how they kind of have weakened. So one thing that these players, oops, didn't want to do that. So one thing these players do is they try to shatter these formations. And white did it immediately with the move E5. It's kind of disruptive. You know, it's giving black a problem in the center of the board. Now, you could take the pawn. But if you take it, white's going to take back. And now, again, do you see what happened to these two pawns on the C file? They really weakened. And the weaker they get, and the more pieces that come off the board, it really makes it a very favorable endgame for white. So what black decided to do after the move E5 was just retreat this knight because it is being attacked. So they backed it up. And you have to be careful here because this bishop now is being attacked twice. You see the battery, queen and bishop battery pointing at this pawn. And I'll put all these terms in the blog so, you know, the newer students can catch up on the vocabulary. But there's two pieces attacking this. And interestingly enough, you don't have to move or trade that bishop. You can just protect it. And there's no law that says black has to take your bishop. But if they did, and you took back with the H pawn, do you see how that file opens up down here with the rook? And I think black might be getting in a little bit of trouble here if this trade went down, but after the move H4, black doesn't necessarily have to take. But in the game, white decided to make the trade on E7. The queen took back, and then they made a trade on D6. And once these pieces came off the board, white was able to see ahead enough to notice that this queen up here on E7 is a target. And white targeted the queen by using a concept known as bringing in the last piece. You have 5 power players left, 2 rooks, 2 knights, and a queen for white. Clearly, this rook on H1 is not working. So if you get an opportunity to activate the rook for free, I mean, I say for free only because black can't do what they want now. They have to take care of their queen, which they did. They just covered up with the move bishop E6. But you can see that white not only got this rook in the game, but they made it their move again. Okay, so how to play from these positions. In the introduction, I mentioned that we're going to be looking at these imbalances or these differences between positions. And one of them, again, is the key squares. Open files. Can you see this line that I'm toggling here with my mouse cursor? And how about the square D6? I know there's a pawn sitting on it, but do you see that how the queen and the rook are attacking that pawn? And that's a target square. So all white did in this position was target the pawn by playing the move knight to E4. And here black played an interesting continuation. What they did was they allowed this pawn to be targeted and played the move rook to B8. So now white can just simply, take a pawn in D6, which they did. If you go back, you can see that black could have taken a pawn. but then they might walk into what we call the mousetrap. The move pawn to b3 will kind of lock the bishop in, and it's going to get taken. I mean, the king can come and attack it, the queen can come and attack it. Black can give up the bishop for a pawn, so they actually got 2 pawns for that bishop, and it really opened up the white king, but I'm not so sure it's worth it in this position. Okay, so let's go back. After the move knight e4, Black said, you know what? I'm going to let you take my pawn in the middle, and I'm going to start putting some pressure on your king, activating the rook using an open file. You see, the key squares, the key files. White took the pawn, Black took once with the knight, queen takes, and now instead of trading queens, playing a position, a pawn down, the black queen swings over to b7. Again, what are these players doing? Using the open lines. Very, very simple. Well, white has a problem. There is a really, really big threat on the board. So if you ignore it, and I mean, I don't really care how much you know about chess, how much vocabulary, all this theory. If you don't see checks and captures and attacks in games, you're going to have a really hard time in the tournaments, because that's how you're going to lose most of your games. As soon as this queen and rook line up together, there's an attack on the b pawn. If you ignore it and play a move like something random like h4, that h4 move again, then black's going to take the pawn check. Your king is going to be forced underneath your queen, and that's something that most WCA players will see instantly. The queen is going to get pinned, and in this position, white is completely lost. So in order not to lose your games quickly, you have to see these one-move threats. And white naturally did, and played the move b3, which is kind of a cool move. They set up this little triangle of pawns on the white squares. So that little formation is fighting against the queen and rook, and also fighting against the bishop. So black, when black saw this, they're talking to themselves too. Black is down a pawn. So black can't just sit there and play all these natural moves and just expect to trade things and lose in the endgame. What black did was they played a move that tried to damage this structure. Not by giving up the bishop, but by playing the move a5. And a5 is designed to follow up with a4, maybe make a trade on these squares, opening more lines to the white king. So white has a choice. White knows exactly what black is trying to do. Now, if white stops black's plan with a move like a4, you see how that stops black's plan? That gives black an option now to sacrifice the bishop. Because if you accept this sacrifice, the queen will take. If you do the math, you'll see that black only got 2 pawns for that bishop. But I'm not so sure I want to play this position as white, because things are wide open, especially this king. So for the price of one little point or pawn, things are actually looking pretty good. So in the game, white didn't really feel like blocking that a pawn. So let's go back. White knows what black wants to do. They want to play the move a4. So white decides to let that move happen by attacking the bishop, thinking that their attack on this bishop is stronger than this pawn moves. Because if you play that way and you allow black to continue to push, then you can just take this bishop, and if they take back, you take another pawn check. The king goes in the corner, and you'll see that this rook is kind of putting some pressure down here. So maybe you block the rook out and you allow black to trade. But there's a huge difference here, huge. The fact that the bishops are off the board, there's only the heavy pieces, the rooks and the queens. I think that white can do really well here. But the question would be, which way do you take back? I think white is okay either way. But it's funny, usually we take towards the center with pawns, but in this particular case, it might be a better idea to take away from the center. And the idea here would be this c pawn for black actually stops the rooks from attacking on this line. This line is covered by this pawn. White would only have to keep an eye on that pawn, which they could easily do by lifting the rooks. And here, black would have to say to themselves, all right, why did I choose this position and be down 2 pawns? Do you think it's worth it? Well, then play this as black. If you don't, then you have a decision to make here when white attacked your bishop. So the player with black decided to keep the bishop on the board. They played bishop to d5. White attacked the bishop, and black decided to get their pawn back. And this, my friends, is a very, very dangerous pawn to take. Sometimes we call these pawns poisoned because after you take the pawn and your piece gets attacked, like what happened in the game, the bishop backed up, and now in this position, it is white to play and win. So again, I don't care how many chess books you've read, how much theory you know. If you don't see tactics and you cannot calculate, you're going to have a tough time in tournaments. So at the WCA, we're going to learn a lot of theory, but we're also going to spend most of our time solving puzzles. Pause your video. White to play and win. Okay, in the game, my friends, white just took the pawn and black resigned. That's right, that's a whole rook, but you're lost no matter what. If you don't take the rook, like if you think it's some evil trap and just move your king out of check, then the queen is going to come to f6, and when this rook moves, it's going to be a really, really nasty discovered check. That's not going to work. So if you take the rook, which is your only other option, now the other rook gives you a check, and you're in big trouble. Your best chance is to cover up with your bishop, and then after that, white just has to find this really cool move, knight f5. Check, check. And notice that the knight keeps the king from coming out here. The bishop cannot take the knight because of this pin here on the rook, so the king has to move. You don't want to come to h8. You're going to get checked and then mated, so your best move is to come here, but white just plays the same move, and mate is really unstoppable. The queen is coming here next to g7. You should all see that the bishop cannot take the knight. Okay? All right. That's a pretty long video, so I'll give you the choice to maybe watch it in 2 sittings, but you should be able to go through what I put in the blog and match it up with what you heard in this video, and hopefully you learned something. All right, my friends, I will see you on the 14th, and we'll chat soon.